I grew up in the Kentish countryside in the 1980s, and I had this mate called Gordon who was properly obsessed with the army and all that stuff, and ever since I could remember, he'd been a military nut. He was the type of kid who played with little plastic army men, collected action dolls, and spent his pocket money at the wartime memorabilia shop in town. He had Airfix model kits of 1,000 different tanks and planes that he'd meticulously glue together and paint. And I tried to make a couple of kits one time and just got glue everywhere, and my paint applications would have made a Warhammer fan weep. Gordon's grandpa Derek was a World War II veteran. He lived alone in a little ground floor flat, and Gordon and I would often go visit the old man on a weekend. He was a genuinely lovely fella. Imagine the classic loving grandpa archetype, and that was basically him. My parents and Gordon's parents were friends, and my nan and granddad were friends with Gordon's grandpa Derek, and so it was never considered strange that Gordon would bring his friends over to visit Grandpa Derek, especially me. Now don't worry, this doesn't end with Grandpa Derek being outed as some nunce or anything. He was a lovely man, right up until his death in a nursing home in the 90s. Alzheimer's is a real bummer. Now, the issue, you see, was with Gordon. It was pretty obvious, even to me as a kid, that Grandpa Derek didn't really like talking about his time in World War II. He especially didn't like how excitable and bloodthirsty Gordon would get when he asked his grandpa repeatedly about those he'd killed. I'm sure Grandpa Derek had lots of thoughts about his grandson's idolation of the war, but he was a loving grandpa who didn't want to upset a little kid, so he just smiled and told whatever stories his PTSD would allow. When the event I'm going to talk about happened, Gordon and I were maybe 10. It was a Saturday, and we'd been to visit Grandpa Derek along with our third friend, Eugene. Eugene wasn't one of Gordon's preferred friends. He kind of tagged along with us and complained about everything, and I understood why Gordon didn't like him, but I did. Gordon was in the mood with me that day for letting Eugene hang out with us, but after we'd visited Grandpa Derek, he kind of perked up. I had no idea why, but I knew that it had something to do with the fact that he disappeared off into the storage room in Grandpa Derek's flat while we were there. After Grandpa Derek's, Gordon led us out into the woods to play. We had a sort of tree fort thing that we were building there that summer, and this was the first time showing Eugene. Eugene whined and moaned all the way through the undergrowth, of course, complaining about brambles and thorns and branches and midges and pine cones. When we got there and he saw our cool fort, Eugene got excited and we played soldiers for a bit. Of course it was soldiers. Gordon only ever wanted to play soldiers, rampaging through the forest with stick guns, pretending to kill each other in a myriad of gruesome ways. And after a while, Gordon called us over and asked if we wanted to see something cool. Of course we did. So he grabbed his backpack, reached into it, and produced 2 items that forever changed my life. One was a gun, which I would later discover was a Luger P08, and the other was a grenade. There were always stories in the news about kids finding live grenades in fields or things like that, and we'd even have an assembly about it when a guy had found one near us. Even if we hadn't, though, I would have recognized what it was because Gordon was so obsessed with war and weaponry. So I also immediately recognized the fact that it was missing the pin. I was concerned that this meant that the grenade was live and dangerous. Eugene wasn't just concerned. In that moment, he was petrified. He pointed at the grenade and actually shrieked at Gordon that it was going to explode at any moment, and that Gordon had no idea how dangerous that thing was that he held. He could kill all of us with it. And I'll never forget the smile that crept over Gordon's face. "I know," he said. Eugene and I looked at each other, exchanging a silent agreement not to make any sudden moves. Gordon carefully tucked the pistol into his jacket pocket and gripped the grenade. "If I press this lever, it'll blow us all up," he said. Now, being the voice of reason, I told him, maybe don't do that. And Eugene just yelled something else. Gordon was looking wistful, talking about how if we blew up, we'd be heroes, dying heroically in battle, he said. I pointed out that it's only a battle if there's an enemy, that it would just be us dying in a stupid accident. Eugene was starting to get frantic, and I could see him glancing over his shoulder like he was getting ready to run. I was genuinely terrified that if he did, Gordon would throw the grenade and just blow us all up. "Please, Gordon," I said. And Gordon gripped the grenade tighter, and now he was talking about honoring his grandpa Derek's fight. What? I thought. This kid was mental. And I told him as much, and Gordon just stared at me and stepped forward menacingly. I didn't stop to think. I grabbed the grenade out of his hand and flung it, and then I braced myself for impact. Silence. We all stood there frozen for a moment, and then Gordon started laughing like a maniac. "It was a model. It's fake." I stared at him, absolutely astounded and speechless. The whole thing had been a prank. Serious, po-faced Gordon had pretended that he was going to kill us all as a prank. That was awesome. I started laughing too. Eugene didn't really see the funny side, but even he was keeping his calm. I think we were both just relieved that our friend wasn't actually mental and we weren't going to die. I shoved Gordon in the shoulder, kind of just good-naturedly, and he laughed and sort of stumbled backwards. Something fell from his jacket pocket, and I heard the clunk of metal, then a loud, echoing bang that made my ears immediately ring. Gordon's face went white. Eugene crumpled to the ground, almost in slow motion. I turned to look at him, mouth agape. I could see a bloody wound on his forehead. When I had shoved Gordon, the pistol he'd stolen from his grandfather, Derek, had fallen out of his jacket pocket and hit a rock. And as I said, we later found out it was a Luger P08. Grandpa Derek had kept it ever since the war. He thought it was unloaded and non-functional, so he said anyway, but it turned out it must have just been jammed or hadn't been used in a while. Hitting the rock caused it to discharge, and the angle that it fell meant that it shot Eugene right square in the middle of his forehead. And shockingly, Eugene was fine. The wound looked nasty, but in actual fact, the bullet had grazed him and ricocheted off the hard, bony part of his forehead. It turns out it can actually be quite hard to lethally shoot someone in the head, but nevertheless, Eugene was incredibly lucky here. It also turned him into the coolest boy in school, a reputation he maintained from then on. And we're still friends to this day, old geezers ourselves now, I guess, and Gene often jokes that being shot in the head as a kid was the best thing that ever happened to him. Grandpa Derek managed to avoid any real trouble for owning that gun. This was quite a while before UK gun laws became a lot stricter, so he got away with a bit of a telling off from the Rosers and his daughter, Gordon's mom. Gordon was in the absolute doghouse, though. His parents made him get rid of all of his military models and toys, and they banned us from visiting Grandpa Derek without adult supervision, mostly for Grandpa Derek's protection, really. Thankfully, things ended up okay, and Gordon grew up to become normal, a well-rounded adult. And the incident and the punishment absolutely put him off any and all interest in the military, though, and the kid who always insisted that he was going to grow up to be a soldier ended up as a manager at Sainsbury's. Gene and I still keep in touch with him, and Gene takes great delight in never letting Gordon live down the time that he shot him in the head. The worst friend I ever had was a kid called William. I was kind of forced to be his friend, and we were put together at kindergarten because our moms were friends, and William decided that I was going to be his. I don't mean his friend, I mean his. You see, in his eyes, he owned me. I was a walking, talking, living, breathing toy for William's amusement. And what I mean by that is his favorite game was making me cry. We were like 5, and already William knew a dozen ways to pinch, prod, poke, and stab me. And his bullying never got noticed. He was the type who'd reach under the table and pinch you on the soft flesh of your thigh, or flick the back of your ear with a rubber band. Because of William, I got a reputation as a crybaby, prone to bursting into tears over nothing. I was too scared of William to tell anyone that he was actually hurting me pretty consistently. Sometimes at recess, he'd make me go behind the school and choke me with my t-shirt collar until I puked. Other times, he would do this burn on my arm and it felt like the skin was going to split. He pulled my hair out, he just prod me with these pins that he had, and I was known as the clumsy kid who was always breaking his toys or tearing his clothes or tripping and crying. But no, looking back, it was always William. I wish there was a twist that I could add here. And William was my imaginary friend, but he was very real. And this very real, very unpleasant torment continued throughout elementary school. There had been one blissful moment where William's family decided to move away because his stepdad got a promotion, but then that fell through and I was stuck with my bully and tormentor, and it seemed like it would last forever. The wildest part is that William also seemed to actually like me and enjoyed spending time with me. Over the years, he'd made sure that I had no other friends, so back then I guess I thought this kind of friendship was normal. Looking back now, it fills me with terror, but back then I genuinely thought William was my friend, and I convinced myself I enjoyed spending time with him in return. I'd invite him over to play most weekends, even though it would inevitably lead to my things getting broken or William somehow getting in trouble with my parents. Occasionally, we would play at William's house. His family was a lot richer than mine. William had a dog, an older sister, and a Nintendo. William would never let me play the Nintendo, but he'd let me watch, always promising that I could get the next turn until inevitably we ran out of time. Another thing William had was bunk beds. This meant on the rare occasion we had a sleepover, it was usually at William's house. Somehow my childish mind would allow itself to be afraid of William at night, so I never wanted to sleep over at his, but occasionally I had no choice because my parents were going away or something. My mom and William's mom were friends, like I said, so William's house was always the first choice if I had to stay overnight somewhere. We were 8 and 9 when this happened. I was the older of us by just a few months, and it was the middle of the night. When I slept over, William let me take that top bunk, and this seemed really exciting to me as someone who didn't have a bunk bed. But later I realized it was because William always slept on the bottom bunk because he was afraid of heights. I woke up to William tugging on my arm. He made me get out of bed and threw water in my face to wake me up. This was typical William fashion. And next he told me we were going to the park. I knew we weren't supposed to go out in the middle of the night, especially not alone at that age, but I really couldn't say no to him. I didn't even have to say anything. He was already reaching to pinch me if I started to protest. Now this was around May and it was warm out. I didn't mind too much that William made me wear my pajamas to the park even though he'd been allowed to dress, and at least he let me wear shoes. At the park near William's house, there was a really tall jungle gym that William never let us play on because he said it was gay. That night, though, it was the focus of his attention. "Climb to the top," he commanded me. Now, I should point out that this was a children's park in the 90s, so there was minimal lighting, and there was one lamp that made things barely visible, but nowhere near enough light to let us play safely on the equipment at night. William didn't care, though. He wanted me to climb to the top of that jungle gym, and by God, was he going to make me do it. Thankfully, I was a pretty agile kid, and the thought of climbing to the top didn't really bother me, even in the dark. Now I climbed up the netting and onto the top bars, knowing it was far easier than facing William's anger. And when I was at the top, William told me to do a handstand. Now, I say I was agile, but I wasn't Spider-Man. William could hurt me as much as he wanted to. I couldn't do something I couldn't do. He knew it, I guess, because when I said no, he just shrugged and turned away. I lost sight of him in that darkness. And then, something hit me in the head, hard. Pain and light flashed before my eyes and I stumbled backwards, which of course meant that I fell 12 feet to the ground. I slammed into the ground and just felt myself, for lack of a better words, break. I have no idea how else to describe it. It was like a sudden, sharp, cracking ping through my body, and then nothing. I could taste copper, though, and smell it, too. I could feel a wetness around my cheek, Was I crying already? No. I was bleeding from what I'd later discover was a serious skull fracture. I tried crying out for help, but there was no sound coming out of my mouth. I just let out a few wet gasps. I couldn't even move my head or turn to look. And I heard William walking over to me, though, and then he sat down facing me. Why wasn't he getting help? And he proceeds to say, "See? This is what happens when you don't do what I say." Then my supposed best friend in the world went off on some rant about how I always needed to obey him because it would keep me safe. That if I'd just done a handstand, I wouldn't have fallen off the climbing equipment. I remember him rocking back and forth a little as he talked, like he was just in complete shock. And at first I hoped that was the case, but the more he talked, the more I realized that he was just excited to see me broken, bleeding, and, as far as I knew at that time, dying. And that's when the pain kicked in. This sort of white hotness throughout my whole body, so bad that I can't even recall how it felt if I tried. I remember feeling relief too. If my legs hurt so much, then I couldn't be paralyzed, right? I still couldn't move though, not at all. I was starting to swim in and out of consciousness. Meanwhile, William, 8 years old, let me remind you, kept lecturing me about how this was my fault, how I brought this on myself. And in that moment, I finally realized that William might actually, genuinely let me die. And nearly a whole hour later, that's how long William waited before going to get help, and I actually believe that he was hoping that I'd die so he somehow wouldn't get in trouble. But he didn't. He had no choice but to go and wake his mom and stepdad. I barely remember the paramedics finally getting there, or the trip to the hospital, or the immediate recovery. What I do remember is the relief that people believed me as soon as I told them everything. It all came out. This years of bullying and torment and torture, how William had forced me to climb up that jungle gym and then throw a rock at my head. The rock had hit me square in the temple and was consistent with that projectile, and I later found out that the doctors had already told my parents that it looked like someone had thrown a rock at me, so I guess they already suspected my friend. I'd suffered a broken arm, 2 broken legs, multiple fractured ribs and vertebrae. I required numerous surgeries and still kind of walk with a limp almost decades later. William's family was responsible for all my medical bills, and still I think my family would have given that kid the death penalty on top of it if they could have. He didn't get sent to juvie or anything, but his mom and stepdad sent him away to some kind of long-term behavioral camp for troubled kids, and apparently he was the youngest kid ever to get sent there. A few years later, William wrote me an apology letter. I didn't even want to read it. My parents let me throw it on a bonfire, and I'm forever grateful to them that they didn't force me to accept his apology, because refusing to do so was an incredibly healing experience for me. I could have never believed his apology was genuine, not after having to lie there bleeding out on the ground as he lectured me about how my fall was my own fault. Now, I don't know what became of William, and I don't want to know. This is the first time I've talked about the experience in years, and to me, the best revenge on William is to treat him as an insignificant footnote. But, William, if by some chance you're also a Let's Read listener and you hear this, then I want you to know, you almost killed me. I was in college in 2007, and I had a buddy, we'll just call him Kieran. Now, I'd known Kieran since middle school, and he'd always been a bit of a weirdo. He also had to be alternative, but in a way that felt very forced, like he was being different for the sake of being rebellious and different. Like he'd get into metal and emo bands, but as soon as any of us liked them, then he'd call them crap. He had a raging hate boner for Metallica, who he saw as the biggest sellouts of all time, and he'd do weird performative stuff like buying Metallica posters just to tear them up. He had this story that he'd tell about buying a Metallica CD and wiping his butt with it. It was pretty stupid, right? Except he'd use this story to try to impress chicks, as if they'd find it sexy that this smelly metal kid with an infected eyebrow piercing had smeared feces on a Metallica CD. Like I said, he was an odd duck. I can't really explain why I stuck with Kieran. I guess it was more like he stuck to me and I didn't have the energy or drive to get him away from me. He was just there through middle school, high school, and then he was part of my group of loyal slackers who went to college in our hometown. And because of this, most of our little group either lived at home or, in the case of a few of the guys, in a shared 3-bedroom apartment that had extremely questionable hygiene. This was known as Andy's apartment, even though Andy just rented it with 2 others. We were stoners and metalheads and slackers, but I like to think that we were all good guys and gals. Kieran didn't really live anywhere exactly. He had loving, supportive parents, but chose to couch surf, crashing on someone's floor or my basement couch. He'd spend weeks at a time sleeping in the bathroom of Andy's apartment until one of them would get sick of him and kick him out. Then he'd do the rounds staying with me or one of the other guys until he was back begging Andy for room and board. This all began when Kieran showed up at my place one night, sliding through the basement window at around 11. He had a method of getting the window open even when it was locked and would occasionally show up and help himself to my snacks or weed even if I wasn't home, and it drove me nuts. Thankfully, this night I was home, chilling and playing some Doom on my PC, which I had finally upgraded enough to run that damn game. Kieran flopped onto my couch, dropped his ratty old bag onto the floor, and told me that he was going to be staying with me for a few days. Okay then. He lit up a bong and sat there smoking it for a while before asking me if I was into occult stuff. I said I'd never really thought about it. Despite being a die-hard metalhead with an interest in horror, I'd never really considered myself into the occult. I was, and am, a Christian, which I reminded Kieran of then, and he responded by doing this weird demonic cackle, like he was trying to act possessed but obviously wasn't. And then he made some absolutely cringe statement about how he was allergic to Christianity, which was odd because he'd never had a problem with my faith or even commented on it before. "Check out this book," he said, or something like that, and I paused my game and turned around to look at him because I was so baffled by his cringelord behavior. The God Delusion had just gotten really popular the previous Christmas, so I figured that he was going to tell me about that. And instead, he was waving around a copy of the Satanic Bible, and it looked like a library copy. Kieran had, he told me, gotten heavily into magic and rituals and crap. According to him, the Satanic Bible was filled with spells and mystical rites that let you summon all sorts of demons. I mean, it isn't, and even back then I knew that, but I couldn't be bothered to argue with him. Next, he pulled out this collected works of H.P. Lovecraft titled The Necronomicon. He told me it was the genuine Book of the Dead and contained dark and terrible secrets. Okay, clearly he hasn't even read it. And he kept going on, showing me a bunch of books, clearly ones that he'd stolen from the library, mostly fiction, and I carried on pretending to be interested but paying no attention, and I thought nothing more of it until maybe a few days later. I was walking through the park at the center of town. It was a huge park that connected to the college and the local high school, so you'd often see high schoolers and college students hanging out in their various groups. You'd rarely see the two together though, so I was surprised when I saw Kieran sitting with a group of goth emo-looking high school students. Our eyes met, and he gave me a kind of angry look and a little shake of his head, like, "Don't come over here, bro." Now I was curious, though, so I leaned against a tree, just pretending to study a textbook. Kieran was talking to the high schoolers, most of whom were girls, about how he could do magic. He knew how to summon demons. He's done successful rituals many times, he said. Typical Kieran bullcrap. And then the conversation took a darker turn. He started telling them how he could grant wishes, as long as the wishmaker engaged in blood sex magic with him. He was waving his freaking satanic Bible around and heavily implying that he could help. Obvious garbage that nobody would fall for, right? So you're probably already seeing the problem. These kids look like sophomores at best. Kai, one of the girls, was a freshman, the kid's sister of a buddy of mine called Jonas. She was 14, maybe 15, and Kieran was 22. and she was the one he was directing his attention at. I watched them a bit longer. Very dumb of me, but as much as Kieran annoyed me, I wasn't ready to throw away a long-term friendship over this without trying to reason with him. On top of that, the rest of the gang was overly forgiving towards Kieran and would rarely accept anything bad about him. And as I was watching, a couple of my buddies from college called me over and we got caught up in conversation very briefly. And when I looked back, Kieran and Kai were gone. I asked one of the boys where the older emo guy who had been hanging around had gone, and they told me that he'd gone with Kai to the store. I knew the store Kai had probably gone to, so I jogged over there. Kai was standing outside looking around awkwardly, and casually I asked her if Kieran was with her. She acted suspicious and very cagey, and I thought that she wasn't going to answer. Then the bell over the door rang and Kieran came walking out, holding plastic bags filled with what I could tell was 2 six-packs of beer. And he looked at me, very guiltily, and mumbled something about seeing me later. In no way was I leaving Kai with Kieran. Kai was looking uncomfortable and awkward and kept glancing at the beer. I could tell Kieran had bought it for her. And I asked them where they planned on going, and he told me they were heading to Andy's apartment. And I told Kai that I didn't think her brother Jonas would be cool with her hanging out with Kieran, and Kai looked like she was about to cry. Kieran suddenly got in my face, pulling me to one side and hissing at me to not ruin this for him. I pointed out that Kai was like 14, and buying her alcohol was messed up, on top of God knows what else he had planned. He assured me it was nothing, and Kai did as well. If they were going to Andy's apartment, I didn't figure that the others would let Kieran get up to anything weird there. They might have been forgiving of him, but they wouldn't let him take advantage of an underage girl. Unfortunately, I had practice and I had to leave them. I hated that fact, but called up Andy, who I trusted with my life, and explained that situation to him. I told him where Kieran and Kai were and to make sure that they did end up going to his place, and then asked him not to let anything happen to Kai. Fast forward to that evening, I got home, grabbed a bite to eat, showered, and then headed downstairs to the basement with a towel around my waist. Kieran was sitting in the middle of the floor, a book open in front of him. Next to the book was one of those huge plastic slushy soda cups that you get from the convenience store. Kieran was bare-chested and looked to be covered in blood, and he was holding a long, thin knife. I asked him what the hell was up and what he was doing here, and his face was all battered, bloodied, and swollen. He forced the words out, explaining how the guys had just turned on him and that they were all dead. At first I panicked, thinking that Kieran meant that they were literally dead, and then he kept going on ranting about how they'd all get what was coming to them, etc. Kieran drew blood and started smearing it on the book. I have no idea to this day what kind of ritual he thought he was performing or why he decided to act like this. I'd also like to stress up front that his state of mind was the product of being drunk and high, not some kind of serious mental illness, at least I think. And of course I didn't know this at the time, but I do now, and I wouldn't be sharing the story if Kieran was a victim in all of this. Now, since Kieran was holding a knife, I decided not to approach him for now, and instead retrieved my cell phone. I had a bunch of missed calls from Andy and even a couple from Jonas, which didn't surprise me. I called Andy back and he explained that Kieran had brought Kai over and tried to get her drunk. And then right in the living room, he started trying to persuade her to do more intimate things with him in exchange for quote-unquote magical blessings. Of course, they weren't having any of this, but Kieran became very belligerent. The guys called Jonas to come get his sister out of trouble, and when Jonas turned up and found his drunk, stoned 14-year-old sister with Kieran, all he saw was red. After being beaten up, Andy said Kieran had fled, and I explained that he was in my basement doing blood rituals. And after laughing their ass off, Andy'd offered to come help, and so that's how Andy and I spent the evening wrestling some drunk, stoned, bloody Kieran out through my house and hurling him unceremoniously onto the lawn. We told him in no uncertain terms that he was no longer welcome around any of us, and if we even heard that he'd been trying to hook up with those high schoolers again, we'd make him wish that he'd never been born. And then Andy helped me add a new, strong latch to the basement window. Kieran became something of an infamous figure around town over the next 15 years. Thankfully, I never had to deal with him again outside of some evil looks, but he went on to become the town creep, basically. All sorts of dark rumors swirling around him, but they're mainly of the predatory, creepy, loser weirdo kind. And thankfully, he never succeeded in his attempts at blood magic or seducing high school girls. I finished high school a few years ago, just before COVID hit. In my senior year, though, my buddy James became a major weirdo after getting heavily into anime. Now listen, I'm not trying to generalize here. I'm into all that kind of stuff as well. I loved Dragon Ball Z as a kid, and I've kept up with a few animes over the years like Bleach, Tokyo Ghoul, Attack on Titan, etc. I love Akira and Ghost in the Shell as much as the next man, and Spirited Away is my favorite movie of all time. Now, I'm not here to dunk on James for liking anime. The problem is the kind of anime he became obsessed with and how it changed him as a person. I think you can probably guess the type. I won't go into details. It happened after he broke his leg just before summer break leading into our senior year. He was immobile, so he spent the whole summer just shut away in his room, watching anime and posting about it online. At first, I thought it was great. I was the one who'd tried to get him into a few shows previously, but then his tweets and Facebook posts got weirder and weirder. And like I said, I won't go into details and give examples, you just can imagine the kind of weird waifu types of posts, just strange and a bit perverted. Now he's always been kind of a milady nice guy type, but harmless with it. He was a bit of a goofball, just a sort of silly, fun guy. And after that summer though, he was downright odd. He'd also gotten some kind of job working online, so between a lack of going out and an increase in disposable income, he'd developed the means to start a particular collection. I first saw it when I got back from a European vacation with my family. I'd been on vacation for just over 3 weeks, so I hadn't seen James in that time. I dropped by his house to check in on him, and it turned out to be the day that he'd had his cast removed. He was back on his feet, so to speak. James led me up to his room and proudly displayed his brand new wall of shelves filled with anime figurines. They weren't normal anime figurines, no. They were all girls, and most of them were in various states of undress. James told me that the collection was displayed in order of when he'd first bought them, and I could see a noticeable uptick in explicit imagery as I went down the shelves. It started out with just girls, then girls in bikinis, and then girls wearing less than bikinis, and then girls engaging in, well, acts. James was super proud of his collection, and I almost thought he was trolling me, if not for the fact that he'd clearly spent thousands of dollars on these plastic girls. It made for the most painfully awkward, uncomfortable afternoon. If you've never spent a few hours with a guy talking you through all the plastic toy girls he owns, while the girls in question gaze at you lustfully, then I severely don't recommend it. It was a big yikes. School started back up after summer break, and I was kind of dreading seeing James again after following his social media posts and seeing his collection. I hadn't exactly been one of the cool kids in the first place, but I'd seen some of the replies James had been getting from our friends and classmates, and I knew that they were laughing at him, not only behind his back, but straight to his face. James had been my best bud for the 3 years that we'd been in high school together. There was no way that I wouldn't end up seen as uncool by association. It would have been different, and I felt like I could stand up for him or justify his weirdness, but nude anime chicks, come on, man, at least keep it to yourself. And sure enough, when school started again, James was just talking about anime and waifus and crap like that nonstop. And looking back, I should have told him to go pound sand much earlier than I did, but I was too nice for my own damn good. Or too lazy, I don't know. Thankfully, James wasn't my only friend, so I started hanging out with Peter and Trent more often, messing around on our skateboards or hanging out in the quad. Strength in numbers meant that even though James was around, I wasn't too tarnished by his weird anime girl persona. And then the transfer student showed up. Her name was Hai. She was a Korean American, and of course, James was immediately hopelessly smitten by her. He was a sad loser though, so of course the idea of just introducing himself to her and being normal never occurred to him. Instead, he got this idea from some anime he'd watched that the way to Hai's heart was leaving notes from a mysterious admirer in her locker. This lasted for 3 notes when Hai caught him slipping the 3rd note into her locker. The way Hai reacted sealed her doom, though. You see, it turns out that Hai was one of the nicest, kindest, sweetest people ever put on God's green earth, and so her natural reaction to James' unrequited love was to let him down gently by telling him she wasn't looking to date anyone right now. She followed this by trying to be a good friend to him. On one hand, I wasn't complaining because it meant that one of the prettiest girls I'd ever seen was hanging out around me. On the other hand, it meant that James would not stop harassing her and hitting on her. He was just gross, always making suggestive comments, always leering at her, being real vulgar and awful, and I just kind of smiled and took it. Meanwhile, she and I were getting close. I'm not sure whether James had worked this out already, but he started showing us photos of his anime girl figurine collection. He'd constantly buy new figures and thrust his phone in our face, showing weird photographs of his silly little statues. And Hai was very polite about it, but it made her more and more uncomfortable until one day, she broke down in tears in my car and told me just how awful James was making her feel. That's when she showed me the DMs. It turns out James had been privately messaging her with his fantasies about her and being his waifu. To this day, I'm not sure that he knew or even cared that she was Korean, not Japanese. Again, not giving examples, but it was vile. And of course, it made my blood boil extra hot because I was really starting to actually fall for this girl. Now, next day at school, I told James in no uncertain terms to back off and leave Hai the frick alone. Amazingly, that worked for about a week. And then, all the madness started. Explicit images were stuck all over Hai's locker. She found an open condom in her bag. Someone wrote a slur on my locker. Someone keyed my car. Crudely photoshopped images of Hai's face stuck on these H-girls that we found around school. And, of course, it was James. He managed to avoid me directly for a few days, and then one day he came storming towards us in the quad, and he started ranting, yelling, crying even about how Hai had broken his heart and ruined him. Then he grabbed her. James grabbed Hai, pulled her towards him into an embrace, and according to him, accidentally groped her chest. She screamed, I screamed. Then I was on James, punching and pummeling and pounding him, feeling his face under my fists, all my rage and disgust at him just pouring out. I was suspended for about a month while the school administration pieced things together. Thankfully, there was security footage and witness testimony that James had grabbed Hai and groped her. I very narrowly avoided expulsion and a criminal record. Thankfully, everyone was so disgusted with James, even his family, that I got off lightly. I absolutely do not recommend solving your problems by punching them repeatedly in the face. I regret what I did, but not because I feel bad for James. James pretty much got away with assaulting Hai, and she wouldn't press charges because she was concerned that it would get me in worse trouble. Honestly, she was probably right, but I hated that creepy anime James basically got away with it and had nothing more than a bruised face and a deservedly damaged reputation. At least he eventually transferred schools, and via some Facebook stalking, I had the satisfaction of knowing that he didn't graduate that year and actually had to repeat his senior year. I know the story would be a lot scarier from Hai's perspective, but, and I kid you not, she feels bad for talking smack about James, so she asked me to send this in from my perspective instead. And in case you're wondering, Hai and I are still together 6 years later, and as for James, we can only guess. I had a friend in high school who very nearly ruined my life. Their name was Leo, and they were smart. Genius-level smart. Too smart for his own good, really, which is why he got bored and did things to amuse himself. I hadn't really known him coming up through middle school and most of high school. I was kind of an average, normal kid who was decently okay at school and decently good at football and baseball. Most of my buddies were more jock types, and Leo was a quiet, smart kid who I always just figured was a band geek or a theater kid. Well, he was certainly theatrical anyway. One day in junior year, he just walked up to me, introduced himself, and told me that he was going to become my new best pal. I was kind of amused by this, and I'm a pretty easygoing and placid fella, so I sort of say, sure, why not? From then on, we spent the next year just hanging out, playing video games, going to the mall, fishing, just normal stuff that kids in the 2010s would do. I grew to really like this Leo guy, and he was a bit strange and mysterious, but it didn't really bother me. We'd never hang out at his house, and I never met his family or knew anything about them. He told me he had a younger brother who died, but I later found out that wasn't even true. He had an older sister who was alive. And that was the first weird thing about Leo. Almost everything he told me during the few months that we were friends was some lie, just completely made up, but in a meaningless way. He told me he lived in one part of town. It turned out to be another. Not for any possible reason either, it just was a part of him amusing himself, I guess. I have no way of knowing exactly the extent of how many lies he told me in that time, but knowing what I know, I'm pretty sure everything he said had a degree of untruth to it. And like I said, Leo would get bored and do kind of insane things just to amuse himself. When all of this was over, he confessed to me that at first, he wanted to see if he could befriend someone and sustain acting like a completely different person to them. Why? Well, he would just say that he was bored. And if this was the extent of it, then it would be a pretty creepy and pointless but ultimately harmless thing. Unfortunately, it didn't stop there. I discovered the following through hindsight, so bear in mind that I didn't know any of this was happening at the time. His project was to steal something from my house every time he visited. It was always something meaningless that we wouldn't notice was gone or wouldn't assume had been stolen. A bottle of bleach, a ceramic banana, a small ornament for my Gram's bedroom. My grandma lived with us when I was a high schooler. A pill from a prescription bottle. Various other things I forget because they were so insignificant. I only know about it because Leo presented them all to me one day. You'll see. His penultimate game was to convince me to be afraid of him. We were in senior year by this point, and he did this by repeatedly dropping hints that he was a serial killer. I didn't work out what some of this meant at the time. He'd tell me that he enjoyed hurting a neighborhood cat, or casually let slip that he'd been following a woman in the dark. And then he started referring to his trophies, and when I asked about them, he became coy and mysterious. And this is when I kind of stopped enjoying hanging out with Leo. I gradually started to drift away from him, and we went on with our lives. Then his final game began. One day I was minding my own business, happily working away in math class when I get called to the office. I had no idea why, of course, so my first thought was something bad had happened at home. This made me anxious and a bit jumpy, which really didn't help, and when I got there, the principal and her secretary were waiting for me, along with a member of the security team. They told me they needed to search my bag and my locker, and to this day I have no idea if they were really allowed to do this, but I had no reason to deny them. First, I emptied out my school bag. Nothing weird to note here, just some books and a pair of gym socks. I remember the principal and the security guard giving each other an odd look. I didn't even think to ask what was going on. I was still generally shell-shocked. Next, they marched me to my locker. They opened it up and searched through everything and again found nothing. And now I finally asked what was up. Sternly, the principal told me that they'd received reports from multiple students about me. Apparently, I'd been talking about a hit list and had confided in a few kids that I had a locker full of firearms at school. Now, of course, all of this was nonsense, and the accusations made me freak out. I broke down in tears there in the hallway. I guess my reaction was so severe that they believed me because the secretary even took me back to the office and made me some tea. I asked who'd accused me because they must be trying to frame me for some reason. The secretary stressed that she couldn't tell me anything, but that it had come from multiple students. and I was so confused. Again, let me remind you that I had no idea about Leo's games at this point. At most, I just thought that he was an unsettling weirdo. A week or so later, I got an apology from the school. They were pretty brash about it, but they said that after further investigation, it turned out that the accusation against me was not credible, and that the students themselves had been misled and thought that they were helping. This last part, in particular, made me extra suspicious and curious, but I was so relieved not to be under suspicion that I just let everything drop. I only found out the truth of everything after graduation. I just started college away in a different state. I had no idea where Leo had gone away to college, and I didn't care to know. I'd always suspected he had something to do with the accusations against me. I'm sure he deliberately waited until we'd gone our separate ways and he couldn't be traced before emailing him. And like I said before, I was a placid and easygoing kid, but I think I would have kicked the crap out of Leo over this if I'd been able to. I got an email. He sent it to my private college email address, of course, just to flex to show that he could track me down, I'm sure. And that's when he told me the truth about everything, or what I'm supposed to believe is the truth anyway. All the random, meaningless lies he told me compared to what the truth actually was. A whole bunch of things that were just utterly meaningless. And next, he revealed all the things that he'd stolen from my house. He took in a photograph of all the items. It had a copy of that day's newspaper in the picture, too. Another pathetic little flex, I guess. I'm sure he thought it made him seem cool and sinister that he kept all those items. To me, it just seemed pathetic. The idea of him transporting all this crap to his new life away at college just felt so sad to me. And then he went on and on about the serial killer stuff, how he'd been trying to scare me and hoped it had worked. And I guess it sort of had, now. And then finally he explained how he managed to convince a bunch of students I was going to do something terrible at school. How he'd managed to work things so that nobody knew the rumors came from him, and everybody involved genuinely thought that they were doing good by reporting me. Then he made sure to add that it was also his doing when I'd been found innocent, because he didn't want me to suffer from being falsely accused. He just wanted me to know that he could. And when I think about it, that's true. It could have been so much worse. If someone sets their mind to ruining you, there's a good chance that they can do some degree, especially when you're a kid and can't necessarily work out how to fight back. If Leo had wanted to make things a lot worse for me back then, he probably could have, because he was literally bored. And that's why I decided not to even reply to his email. Let him get it out of his system and forget me. And I never did hear from him again. It's been quite a few years now, but anytime something goes wrong for me, I have to wonder. Anytime something happens that I can't explain, my first thoughts go to Leo. Is he back? Is he screwing with me again? Has he thought of another game? I have no idea what became of Leo since he last emailed me, but I hope he's occupied. I really don't want to find out what happens if he ever gets bored enough to remember me again. So just a quick story that I wanted to send to you. I wanted to tell you about an absolutely terrifying encounter I had with a now very much ex-friend of mine. This was a few years ago when I was living in Brighton in the United Kingdom. I had this mate, we'll call him Ken. And like me, Ken was part of Brighton's thriving LGBTQIP2SAA+ scene. Whereas I'm a pansexual woman, Ken was a very flamboyantly gay man. Despite being pansexual, I'm nearly always only attracted to guys, so Ken and I would have many nights out in the pole, gossiping over dudes, pulling hotties, and all sorts of good times. He was quite the giggle, but for 2 years of our friendship, I would have told you that Ken didn't have a bad bone in his body. But boy, was I bloody wrong. That Friday evening, Ken dropped by for some pre-drinks before we were going to hit the nightlife. It was peak summer, and a big party was going down in Brighton Beach, hosted by a local radio station. Me and Ken were sipping daiquiris and talking about something, probably BGT or Strictly or some show we used to watch back then. And that's when I casually mentioned that I was meeting up with a new Tinder date at the party that night. And Ken sort of froze and looked really weird. I asked him what was up, and he launched into a rant about meeting strangers on the internet. Now bear in mind, this wasn't too long ago, so it was way after online dating apps had become totally normal. And I laughed and told him that he sounded like my old nan, and not to be such a worrywart. Ken wouldn't let it go, though. He just kept going on and on about it, how it was a bad idea to meet a guy from Tinder and I'd regret it. I laughed, and maybe snapped at him a little because I was really excited for this date, and why should Ken be panicking now? I'd met guys on Tinder before, and he'd met people on a bunch of apps. I was doing my lippy in the mirror when I saw Ken come up behind me. He grabbed me from behind in a chokehold, his arm locked around my neck. He started hissing something about how strange men can easily overpower me, and there would be nothing I could do. I started to laugh nervously and try to wiggle away from Ken's grasp. He would not let go, and in fact, his arm tightened around my neck. I could barely breathe. My vision was starting to blur at that moment. "Get the F off of me," I shrieked, and tried jerking away from him. I elbowed him in the side, and I guess I did it harder than I meant to because I actually felt a faint crack from his ribs. Ken absolutely lost it. He slammed me forward, smashing my face into the mirror, which shattered with the blow. The next thing I know, I'm on the floor. Blood was pouring into my eyes, and Ken's on top of me, punching me in the face and neck. I'm screaming, howling, slapping at Ken, scratching at his face, and I felt one of my teeth break, and I spat blood and a tooth at Ken. And that must have somehow snapped him out of it because he jumped up off of me and started screaming in terror. And then he frantically was moving about the room like something was after him, and I'd never been so scared in my entire life. Suddenly he calmed down out of nowhere, sat on the sofa, and just started sobbing quietly to himself. Well, it turns out that afternoon Ken had done a bit of a certain white powder, but I guess it was laced with God knows what and caused a bit of a temporary psychotic break. My face, tooth, and well-being took the brunt of it, I guess, and I found this out later. At that point, obviously I called the law and got Ken taken away, and then I went to the hospital, got checked out, treated, and stayed with friends. Obviously, I realized something had gone seriously wrong with Ken and he wasn't behaving normally. I'd found out what had likely happened through some friends of mine who'd bought from the same dealer as Ken and had been told that the drugs had been contaminated. I decided to drop any charges against him if he paid for my tooth replacement and then kept the hell away from me. And yes, Ken didn't mean to go that far, but it was his choice to partake in the nose candy, and he still had that kind of violence deep within him. While I don't hold any hatred in my heart for him, I simply couldn't ever feel comfortable around him again, and I severely hope that wherever he is now, he isn't endangering anyone else. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern Time, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email, letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com, and you might even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, or you can hear all the stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, we're all going to eat you, Roki.